So now we could invite Professor Chitralekha Zutshi to join us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Chitralekha, for being with us. Professor Chitralekha Zutshi is probably our foremost historian on modern Kashmir. In fact, what I may know about modern Kashmir largely stems from an assiduous reading of her work. Recently, she's published an excellent biography of Sheikh Abdullah. So today she's going to be speaking to us on a theme which will become evident when she elaborates on it. But thank you so much, Chitralekha. And again, the half an hour plus 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip, for inviting me and for the trust for organizing this conference. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I think I would have learned a lot had I been there. But so I'm here to speak to you about the development of sort of Islamic identity and reform movements and so on in a princely state that's obviously at the other end of the subcontinent, quite literally. But hopefully some of the things that I talk about will resonate with what you have been talking about. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to make the kind of direct connections that Roy was able to make with Kerala and so on. But let's see what we get out of this. So before I start talking about the early 20th century, I just want to sort of sketch out a little bit of the historical background for Islam in Kashmir, because I think it's important for some of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about. So Islam transition, or rather Kashmir transitions to Islam through the course of the 14th century. And it does so as a result of the coming of Sufi mystics from Central Asia and Persia into Kashmir. So there's a very strong connection between Kashmir and that whole region of Central Asia and Persia. And these Sufi mystics are very deeply tied, once they come into Kashmir, they're very deeply tied to both the land, the landscape, but also the sort of the politics of Kashmir at that time. Because at that time, Kashmir is also transitioning into the Kashmiri Sultanate, right? And the Kashmiri Sultanate and these Sufi mystics who represent particular silsilas, right? So they are the Kubraviyas, the Sohrawardiyas, the Nurbakhshiyas, the Naqshbandiyas, and what they are doing is that they're competing for followers. They are competing for legitimacy from the Sultanate, which is then handing them sort of spaces to build their shrines on. So very early on, what you find happening in Kashmir with the sort of its transition to Islam is the development of a very strong shrine culture, right? And when I say shrines, I don't mean sort of these places of meditative practice and so on. What I mean are really centers of political power, right? And interconnections with the narrative, the linguistic, the literary, the political landscape of Kashmir. I mean, it's all happening on the site of these shrines. So when people say, for instance, it's kind of fashionable to say that, Kashmiris practice a different kind of Islam because it's based on shrine culture. I think that's a sort of, completely kind of wrong-headed way of looking at it. And it's coming from a very sort of Indian nationalistic perspective. Shrines are extremely important in Kashmir because they are the center of politics, not because it's kind of an expression of a different kind of Islam, right? So what you find is that, very early on, then shrine culture becomes the way that Kashmiris think about their Islamic identity. And I'm saying this because, this will become relevant for later on, right? So, as the Kashmiri Sultanate itself is coming into existence, the sultans are giving sort of, waqfs, like trusts, to these, Sufi mystics and Sufi silsilas who are then establishing their shrines on particular areas. And there's a fierce competition for followers and political and social influence amongst these various silsilas that draws in, and is basically the kingmakers, I mean, it draws in the court, the Sultanate, the court of the sultans. It draws in the entire sort of narrative culture and so on. But all of this is being built on what already exists in Kashmir, right? So Kashmir, of course, before the 14th century is a center of, Buddhist, culture. It's a center of Sanskrit literature and so on. So all of this, the gradual transition from Sanskrit to Persian is also happening at this time in the 14th century. And this is all sort of overlaid. It's kind of a palimpsest. And it's all happening in the site of these shrines, which are kind of adopting and adapting Kashmir's intellectual, political, social, and economic landscapes to fit its transition to Islam. Right? So this is the very brief sort of backstory for what I'm going to be talking about, which is then the expression of Islamic identities in the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, of course, comes into existence in 1846, right? Through a treaty between a Dogra potentate who used to be, part of the Sikh kingdom of the Punjab, right? But helped the English East India Company in defeating the Sikhs in the 1840s. And so in 1846, he was given this the parts of the Sikh kingdom. The Kashmir Valley, of course, was part of the Sikh kingdom until 1846, from 1819 to 1846. So the Kashmir Valley, which is the heart of sort of, the Kashmiri Muslim culture, that was attached to Jammu, right? And also parts of Ladakh and so on, and cobbled together into this princely state. The majority of the population of which was Muslim, right? So if you look across all of these, whether it's Ladakh, Jammu, Kashmir, it was, majority Muslim. Kashmir Valley, of course, is the heart of this princely state, in the sense that it's where majority of the Muslims live. But of course, it had a very significant Hindu population and a very significant Sikh population as well, because it was part of the Sikh kingdom for a while. The Dogra rulers, of course, were Hindu, right? And the way that they sought legitimacy was by emphasizing their Hindu identity, and also by extension emphasizing Kashmir's Hindu identity, which of course was, it's fairly simple to do, in the sense that you can kind of, bypass the centuries of Islam in Kashmir and go to, the pre-Islamic period. And that's what they kind of, brought out. It's Aryan heritage, it's Sanskrit texts, it's Hindu temples. So there was a fairly important sort of archaeological project that was carried out under the Dogras, which unearthed sort of these Hindu temples and Buddhist temples of Kashmir, and completely ignored the Muslim shrines, right? So again, and in fact, the Dogra state took over some of the mosques and shrines in Kashmir and used them for various sort of administrative purposes, like storing arms and so on and so forth. So they also, of course, revived the ban on cow slaughter and all sorts of things to kind of assert the Hindu identity of Kashmir, and kind of sidelined, of course, the Kashmiri Muslim population. Now I'm talking about the valley in particular, but they were doing this everywhere, obviously. They also import sort of non-Kashmiris into Kashmir to run the administration. So Kashmiris are out of jobs, and so there's economic, political, and all these kinds of impacts of Dogra rule on the Muslim population. So what you find is that by the late 19th century, so 1846 is when the princely state comes into existence and the Dogras take over. By the late 19th century, Kashmiri Muslims are beginning to kind of look at their community and say, okay, so this, we need to do something, to get the state to pay attention to the fact that we are, backward, we are, we are lagging behind in education, we have no government jobs, the entire community is in a state of, benightedness, right? And that's when in the late 19th century, these, the kind of reformist Muslims, they take control of the try to take control of the community. They establish schools. for Kashmiri Muslims. They also start petitioning the state, outlining the grievances of the Muslims. By state, I mean the Dogra government, right? But they are also at the same time battling, okay, for control over the shrines, right? So if you are kind of asserting Kashmiri Muslim community identity, what does it mean to be Kashmiri Muslim? And those debates become really significant in the late 19th century. And again, not surprisingly, they coalesce around on the site of shrines, but also on the issue of shrine worship, right? So now the question of, that I was just, talking about a second ago, is Kashmiri Islam not Muslim enough, right? Or not Islamic enough, I should say. That, somehow is shrine worship, not Muslim. And this, of course, is the impact of Wahhabis, right? So the Wahhabi movement, there are, amongst the Muslims, there are some who believe that shrine worship is sacrilegious to Islam, and that it's a celebration of saints in a way that's very problematic in Islamic terms. And for others, of course, shrine worship is central and key to the way that Islam is expressed and practiced by Kashmiri Muslims. So there's two sort of segments of the community that are battling with each other over the definition of Islam in the late 19th century. And and again, at the heart of this is control over these sacred spaces themselves, right? I mean, who is going to control these? Who's going to have control over the pulpits of these shrines? Because that's where you can reach the most people. Ultimately, the Dogra state has to kind of step in, and it divides, right, the sacred spaces in Kashmir, in the urban areas of Kashmir, into these two sort of head preachers of Kashmir, the Mirwaises, and says, okay, the followers of this Mirwais can only, this Mirwais can only preach from these shrines, and this Mirwais can preach from these shrines. So the state kind of, ends up sort of, legalizing these kind of divisions in very interesting ways, right? Or litigating them, let's say. So by the 1920s, the Muslims, Kashmiri Muslims who have been educated at some of these institutions, right? So there are the educational institutions themselves are also divided along these lines, right? So there are either those that really emphasize the importance of shrine worship, and then there are those that say, the shrine worship is sacrilegious, we should focus on the mosques of Kashmir. So, the Muslims who go to these educational institutions are coming of age in the 1920s. They graduate from these institutions. They try to look for jobs or higher educational opportunities after school in Kashmir itself, and they are not available for Muslims. And so many of them, of course, go off to British India, right? Punjab is the place where they go, right? So the connection between the Punjab and Kashmiri Muslim identity is very, very close. The Punjab, of course, if you know about the Punjab in the late 19th century, I mean, it's a hotbed of various different Muslim movements, right? So you have the Ahmadiyas, the Ehras, the people like Muhammad Iqbal. I mean, there are all sorts of people who are, discussing, Muslim identity in the context of sort of Indian, nationalism, and anti-colonial nationalism is emerging and so on. And of course, by the 1920s, the Khilafat movement and such. So a lot of these Kashmiri Muslims who go to the Punjab are exposed to these ideas for the first time, right? And they're coming from this context where, Kashmiri Muslims have absolutely no opportunities in Kashmir at all. And many of them have kind of seen, so for instance, Sheikh Abdullah, who I'm going to talk about in a second. Sheikh Abdullah comes from a very modest background. And his own, he grew up in kind of straitened circumstances, looked around him and saw the poverty of the Muslims, which stayed with him throughout his life. So many of them kind of see the situation of the Kashmiri Muslim community, and they're in the Punjab. And for the first time, they can put sort of this put what they have been saying in some kind of a context, right, of broader context of, Muslim identity and reform. And what is more important in the Punjab, of course, is that many of the organizations of the Ahrars and Ahmadis and so on, they have all taken up Kashmir as a cause, right? Or the cause of Kashmiri Muslims as a cause. So there's the Kashmiri Muslim Committee, for instance, that's founded in 1912 in the Punjab, is run by Ahmadis, and the Ahmadis really want to promote the cause of Kashmiri Muslims. So the Kashmiri Muslims who go to the Punjab meet up with these organizations and these ideas that are circulating, and when they come back, and one of these is Sheikh Abdullah, of course, who goes to who goes to Islamia College, Lahore, in 1924. And 1924, interestingly, is also the moment when in Kashmir itself, it's a very fraught time. A new Maharaja, Maharaja Hari Singh has taken over. And he's trying to initiate reforms, but they are obviously not, they're too little, too late type of thing. There's shortages of food in the cities. There's a whole bunch of urban sprawl. There's urban conflicts. Factory workers in Srinagar, for instance, in the silk factory, they've gone on strike for the first time. Lord Reading, who was the Viceroy of British India, when he visited Kashmir, or he visits the Dogra ruler in 1924, he's presented with a memorial by Kashmiri Muslims saying that they're doing really poorly in the state, and the state needs to do something about it. So it's a really kind of critical moment when these young men go off to British India, and they are imbued with these ideas about economic rights, political freedom, and so on. And they come back, and so Sheikh Abdullah is one of them. He comes back in 1930 looking for some kind of government position. So at this time, what they really want is for Kashmiri Muslims to be able to enter government service, right? And they are met with kind of closed doors. So that's when they start in the early 1930s. Sheikh Abdullah, for instance, gets hired as a school teacher, and it's from there that he really takes on the leadership of the Kashmiri Muslim community. And it's interesting that the people who push him to the forefront, there are a number of other candidates for the leadership of this community who are equally qualified, but the older generation of leaders push him forward because he has very little political connections, right? So he was, as I said, from a modest family who had no connection to government service. His father died before he was born. So there was he had nothing to lose. He was fearless. He was charismatic. He was 6'4", quite literally a presence. And he had, of course, when he was in Lahore, was deeply influenced by Muhammad Iqbal and his ideas, and would recite his poetry, and could sort of recite the Quran in Arabic, but then also translated stories into Kashmiri. And the thing about Sheikh Abdullah was that he spoke the language of economic and political rights in the Islamic idiom, right? In a really resonant way for Kashmiris. And so he was kind of chosen to lead the community, and he started sort of basically giving speeches from these shrines, right? Started giving speeches from the shrines, and was arrested immediately by the Dogra government. And so he made prison going into sort of this political act. And as he kept going into prison and being released and coming out and going back again, this became sort of a way for him to assert his leadership, and people sort of, Kashmiris, ordinary Kashmiris, began to see him as sort of this messiah. There's several interesting things here. So one of which is that Sheikh Abdullah realized very quickly that if he was truly assert himself as a leader, he had to sideline the earlier, more religious leadership, right? So the mirwaises, the head preachers of of Kashmir. And again, the way he did this was by asserting his control over the shrines and the sacred spaces of the valley. So who gets to preach from these places, and who gets to define what Islam really means in the context of Kashmir, right? So the charge that was leveled against Sheikh Abdullah by this older generation of Kashmiri Muslim leaders was that he was an Ahmadi, right? Ahmadi is, the followers of Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, right? Who were seen as not being Muslim, right? So, he's an Ahmadi, he was in Lahore and he converted to, Ahmadism, if you will, and he's not a true Muslim, right? But the charge that Abdullah leveled against the Mirwais now, it interestingly had a political tinge to it. And what he said was, he didn't say that he's not Muslim, he's Muslim, and so on. What he instead said was, these Mirwaises, the head preachers, they are loyalists of the Dogra regime, right? So while he was being called, anti-Muslim, what he said was, it doesn't matter. This is not about Islam any longer, because we are all Muslim, and I'm Muslim. I'm a devout Muslim. But the real issue here should be, are you loyal to this regime, or are you loyal to the people, right? And so, and if you are loyal to the people and you're not in the pay of the Dogra regime, that's what he basically said, that these Mirwaises are paid, which they were, right? The state would pay them to be the head preachers. So if you're not in the sort of, basically in the, being, puppets of the Dogra regime, then, you can't really claim to be the leader of the community. And this was a very effective charge against the Mirwais. And what Sheikh Abdullah was able to do as a result was really, gain control of these sacred spaces. Hazrat Bal Shrine, for instance, just shrine dating from the time of Aurangzeb, the 17th century, that place really became the center of not just Sheikh Abdullah's leadership, but how he asserted Kashmiri sovereignty, right? So Kashmiri sovereignty over their own land and their own sacred spaces and so on. And so there are several things that he did to do this. So this took on a class dimension, right? So the followers of the Mirwais, or the head preachers, were the ones who wanted to enter government service, right? And not really shake up the status quo. The followers of Sheikh Abdullah, as he matured as a leader in the early 1930s and mid to late 1930s, were people who wanted to shake up the status quo, to create a freer society. And what that needed, and Sheikh Abdullah realized this very quickly, right? What that needed is that you needed to bring in the minorities on board. So you can't just make this a Muslim movement. It has to be something that includes Hindus and includes Sikhs. And so, and several Kashmiri Pandits, for instance, became very important in this movement at this time. One of them, Premnath Bazaz, wrote a biography that Sheikh Abdullah was gay, because he was a devout Muslim, just like Gandhi was a devout Hindu, and yet someone who thought of Kashmir as a plural society, right? Who thought of it as plural. Of course, the term they used was secular, but what they're really talking about is religious pluralism, something that accommodates all of these people. And then when you are asserting political and economic rights, or rather asking for political and economic rights for the state, you can't just ask them for Kashmiri Muslims, you have to ask them for everyone. So all of these communities, and they found a newspaper called Hamdard, which basically becomes sort of the mouthpiece of the movement as it transitions into transforming the the Jammu and Kashmir Muslim Conference into the Jammu and Kashmir National Conference, right? So this thing of, from the idea of Islamism, you have to go to the idea of nationalism, right? Nationalism for Kashmir, but nationalism is something that becomes really important for this movement and for this journal Hamdard. But what it also does, it lays. Yeah, I see that I have 5 minutes.
Yes, very good, well spotted.
Yeah. So what this lays, I'm just going to end with this, that as this is happening, this transition from sort of the Muslim to national, right? The national that encompasses sort of is defined by the majority Muslim and yet encompasses sort of these other communities, is that it lays sort of this enduring divide in Kashmir. And because those people who want the movement to represent just Muslims are also those people, they're of different class. They are the elite, so there's a class dimension. But they also happen to be from Jammu, right? So there are some, of course, like the head preacher of the Kashmir Valley, that are Kashmiris, but they're Jammu Muslims, right? The Jammu Muslims sort of have a very different idea of what they want from the state, and they want the interests of Muslims to be preserved, and they feel that what Sheikh Abdullah is doing is really kind of betraying this, right? And so the Jammu and Kashmir divide, which you see even today, right, in the Jammu and Kashmir context, is laid at this moment. And it really becomes the fault line along which you see the, sort of, partition and the things that happen during partition, and then what happens after as well, being laid out, right? So this idea of, Muslims should come first also has this regional dimension. So religion, region, and nation kind of, overlap in very interesting ways in this context. So I'm going to stop there and maybe answer questions that might have come up. Yeah.